So the first thing we're going to do is create a box. This is going to be the base for our tubes, for our lighting. And we're just going to rest that on the negative y-axis so that anything we create will now sit above that base structure. For the neon signs, I'm going to use the pipe tool that comes with Lightwave CAD. And let's have a look at some of the settings that I use to create the tube. So let's just click on the base and we'll just create very quickly some random tubing. And let's have a look and at my settings. So it's set to polygons, the shape type is set to circle, the width diameter is set to 25mm, sides per segment is set to 2 because I'm going to subpatch this later and that gives us 8 sides. Rail mode is set to line. Offset mode is set to handles. Now the reason I've set it to handles is because we turn it off, it just rests it back on 0. Offsets it to the 75mm. But if we have handles on, it puts these 2 little handles at the beginning and end of the pipe structure, and this comes in really handy when we're creating the neon tubes that you saw in the final picture. So let's go back and we'll just start, that's our start point. Because we're going to subpatch it, I'm going to put the next one really close to the start point and you'll see why. And then we'll do another one. And then every time I do like a corner or a junction, I put in 3 points. So I'm creating my cuts in the geometry as I go along, because obviously when we're going to subpatch it, they'll make the geometry sort of closer together and tighter in those areas. So let's just click here, here, one there, one there, down there, down there. And then we'll get to the corner and again we'll put in 3 points, control point, and then we'll just, the end bit, well, it turns back down and the tube goes back into the base. There we go. We're going to leave a space just between the in and out parts of the tube, and you'll see why later on when we come to put the sort of feet, the connectors in at the bottom of the tube. Yeah, pretty happy with that. So, and right, let's just do a little bit of housekeeping. So I'm just going to create a new layer, call that background, and take the geometry for the base and put that in the background. And this layer we're going to call it tubes outer, and we'll have a look at that. Right, one thing we do need to do, we just need to put some extra cuts on the geometry there. And I'm just using bandsaw with sharp cuts, percentage at either end, so it cuts, I think it's 5% either side. And we'll do that on the other one. So then when we subpatch the model, you can see now we've got this nice tube, and the edges are being controlled by the places where we placed the piping points. Okay, for the 2 bits of geometry left over from the pipe tool, I'm going to put them into their own layer, called the layer feet. I'm going to flip them over so that they are facing the positive y-axis, and you'll see why later on. So let's go back to the tube outer layer, and what I want to do is I want to give this layer some thickness. So that's like the outer casing of the neon tube, and the way that we do that, we're going to go and grab the thicken tool. Let's have a look at the settings that I use for thicken. So we're using the normal algorithm. We're going to use 3 segments. They're going to appear at the bottom of your thicken geometry, and we're going to use this part of thicken which creates a new surface. So the new thickened surface will have its own surface name. So the inner part or the outer part, depending on how you thicken the object, will have its own surface name. And we're just going to call this tube inner. And there we go, let's just thicken that. And we'll bring it in a bit. And I want it to be about -5mm. So we'll just set that to -5mm. Let's have a look. If we zoom in, you can see that we've got this nice 5mm thick neon outer tubing. And because we used that part of the thicken tool that created a new surface, we can now go to the polygon statistics window and select that surface from there. And what this allows us to do then is take that to another layer, and we can create the inner part of the neon tube, the part that emits the light. We're going to flip that over, go back to our tube's outer layer. We're going to press Q on the keyboard, change that surface to tube glass, that's one I created earlier. We're going to go and change the colour a little so that we can easily see it between the two different textures. So now we've got the outer tubing of the neon tube, and then we've got the inner part, which is the part that emits the light. But what we need to do with the inner part of the tube is just shrink it down a little, because you'll get some render errors where the geometry's taking up the same space. So what we do is we just use point normal move, and we just bring that in a little so that we've got a little bit of a gap between the outer tube geometry and the inner tube geometry. But with point normal move, you'll see that it's not quite shrunk the geometry correctly in the tightest part of the tube. So all I do is I select each ring and use the size tool, bring that in a bit, select the other one, select the ring, and then bring that in as well. Turn subpatch back on, and now our inner tube looks a lot better, and there's no geometry poking out to the outer casing. So to create the geometry for the feet, that's the bit where the neon tube comes in and out of the base. What we have to do is take a single ring of the tube geometry, and we take it to its own layer, and then we'll center it. And then I've got this plugin from Mike Green called Subpatch Cylinder. And all it does is it creates a cylinder that's already subpatched, so you don't have to mess about merging triangles, etc. So we're just going to bring that to a bit larger than the tubing itself, and then we're just going to use multi-shift, and we'll multi-shift in the geometry at the top. So first edge loop, and then another edge loop, and another. So I'm just holding the control key down and clicking to create new geometry as I go along, and I'm just creating geometry at the edges so that when we subpatch it, it'll shape nicely. So I'm just using the edit tool, and I'm adding some more loops in, and then we'll do that at the bottom as well, again using multi-shift. So just holding control down, clicking and dragging in, and then when we subpatch, turn that on, we've got a nice round little connector where the tube is going to appear at the base. So we're going to rest that on the positive, on the positive y-axis, I'm going to rename the layer Feet Geometry. And if we now go back to the layer that had the extra bits of geometry left over from the creation of the pipe at the beginning, what we can do now is we can use place mesh to copy the geometry from a background layer onto the geometry we select in the foreground layer. So with the feet geometry layer selected in the background layer, we run place mesh and we simply use the populate function within place mesh, and all that does is it takes whatever you had in the background layer and it makes a copy onto any of the geometry that you have in the foreground layer. Okay, so let's return to the other two layers, and there you go. You see now that the copied geometry fits perfectly to the bottom of the neon tubes. Let's give them their own surface, and that looks looking pretty good. So the next part is to make the supports for the long parts of the neon tube. So to create the support arms for longer parts of neon tubes that you saw in the final render, the final image, we need to take a part of the geometry of the neon tube, the outer casing part, and we're going to use that as the base to build the first support part, the metal ring that goes around the outer tube, and then we'll build sort of like a bracket and a face plate with screws that would fit into the support base that we have in the background layer. So we're just going to center that up, and then I'm going to use thicken. This time we don't need the create a new surface. So we're going with thickening outwards this time, because obviously the class part wants to be away from the neon sign. Again, we're just adding in cuts, loops, so that when we subpatch this it'll be nice and tight on those corners. We do the same in the middle, so I'm just bandsaw on that one again with the 5% either side. Yeah, that's looking good. Got a nice ring on that. And then we're just going to take the inner part and we're just going to expand it a little using point normal move, so that it's not actually touching the outer casing of the neon tube. So fast forwarding a bit, and I've just created the base plate and the bracket arm, again using very simple geometry. The bracket itself is Mike Green's plugin again. The bracket base is just a box subdivided several times, and then I've used another plugin that I use quite a lot called PX Naval 64, and that just allows you to take 4 polygons within some already created geometry, and it creates a perfect hole for you. And then I've just used some screws from stock geometry that I've got elsewhere. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take that as one layer. I'm going to give it its own surface name of clasp. We're going to take that back, and we're now going to line it up to some part of the tube where it's straight, so that it looks like it's supporting that part of the neon tube. So if we just drag it down to the bottom, we can see that that's not the correct orientation. So we'll just highlight the clasp part, and we'll rotate that so it's facing the same way as the neon tube. And with that in mind, I think that's everything done regarding modelling. So let's take everything over to layout, and we'll have a look how we set everything up inside of Octane Renderer. So back over to layout, and this is the final scene that I've set up. The tubes took a little longer to create than just the basic one we showed you previous, but it was the same sort of method, and all I did was I assigned different textures to the inner part so I could make them different colours. And let's have a quick look at the setup. So if we go to editor, and it's just a very simple Las Vegas HDRI image, and I've got a blurred version that I'm using as the visible environments. That gives it a nice looking sort of DOF effect. Nothing spectacular, just your thin lens camera. We've got some post-processing, so we've got some bloom so that it highlights the neon lights a bit more, sort of blows them out. And that's pretty much everything in the render target. So let's have a look at the surface settings for the neon signs. So if we go to white, which is one of the outer ones, and all we've got is universal material with texture emission into the emission input. Power set to 500. And then what's driving the efficiency is the Gaussian spectrum texture. And then all we do with this is if we want to change the colour of the lights, we can just add the 15%. We can drop this down to 5. There we go, got a nice purple. Let's do 50, get some greens and yellows. 60, more to yellow. 75. Now we get into our reds and oranges. 90 up to deep reds. And that's all I did until I found one that I was happy with. And then just distributed those between orange, yellow, and again orange, so just duplicated that one. And then I set samples to, I think it was 1200 samples. Using direct lighting, adaptive sampling, and we let denoising do the final bit of cleanup for the final render. So that's the end of another tutorial, and I hope you found that interesting and informative. Any questions, stick them in the comments below, and give it a like. Subscribe if you want to subscribe. If you want to see any more tutorials, give me a shout.